This is the 5th part of this manhwa. If you haven't watched the previous chapters, I recommend that you do so. Jones is so confused that he asks Irene again what she said, and she says she believes that the protagonist is not human, just like him, which leaves him speechless. And she starts saying that the protagonist is a paladin, so he couldn't not be human. But Irene sees that his eyes avoid her violently, so she understands that her suspicions are true. And remembering her words, she wonders where he has actually come from. Night falls, and we see that the Duke's soldiers are completely exhausted. When one of his officers asks Fernandez what to do, as the protagonist's knights continue to attack them and their allies have surrendered or withdrawn from the battle. This makes the Duke explode in despair, saying that the existence of the protagonist is a disgrace to the art of war, so he's going to kill him. But then he faints from exhaustion, and we are told that 36 hours after the protagonist went to war, the tide turned. The army of Duke Fernandez surrendered to the protagonist, and the only person who kept fighting was King Benedict II of Isaac. So we see the protagonist outside the castle where he took refuge, challenging him to come down. But he refuses and challenges him to storm the castle instead. This frustrates the protagonist, but Carl tells him not to worry because there are more troops inside than the castle is designed to hold. So it will collapse in 3 days, but the protagonist says that if they wait for that, more people will die too. And he can't bear to see the soldiers die because of the king, whom he believes he must find a way to withstand. In a scene change, a messenger informs the Pope that the King of Alan is upset, and until he explains what happened in the capital, he will block all church activities in his kingdom. The religious leaders discuss the situation and say that due to the protagonist's supernatural abilities and his knights, they might have made a deal with the demon, but the spirit did not warn them about it, so they can't do anything. And at this rate, the protagonist could become another representative of the Holy Spirit, which would confuse people about whom to believe. They conclude that the key is that they know nothing about him, although the truth is that he is a paladin approved by the Holy Spirit. Then they ask the Pope what they should do, and he says they should send Dean, the pastor who knows the protagonist, to gather information about him. In addition to Archbishop Andrew, who will investigate the source of his power. We see that Shelley has a headache because she slept all day after talking to Irene. She goes for some water when she encounters the protagonist, who startles her and she breaks the cup over his head. She forgives him and asks what he's doing there because she heard he went to confront the king. He tells her he's there because he failed in that task. The protagonist explains that the king hid in a castle, but he failed to capture it because he doesn't want to cause casualties. The goal is to judge the king for his crimes, not to kill people. At first, he thought that by focusing on the king, he could convince the soldiers who followed him to abandon him. That's what happened in the Battle of the White City, and he wanted to try it again because as a paladin, he also has to preach. But after reciting a verse, he was shot with crossbows, which Shelley thinks is natural. Catherine advised him to reach an agreement with the king and the church. Vivian suggested destroying the castle. The cat just wanted to sleep. Irene told him a bunch of political things that he didn't understand, and Pastor Dean was missing. So he had to turn to Shelley for help, and she is upset about being lower than the pastor on the protagonist's trust scale. She asks if his failure is because he didn't want to cause casualties, not because he couldn't attack the city. He tells her that's right because he can easily attack it, but if there were mass casualties, he wouldn't be any different from the king. And Shelley thinks that the protagonist went to the wrong person because she is not a good person like Irene. And she tells the protagonist to go preach his sermon as usual, but following the crucial steps she tells him. There we see the soldiers who see the protagonist approaching with his book again and insult him because they are trapped because of him. The protagonist questions if Shelley's method will be reliable because he feels like he's forcing people to accept his faith. But still, he starts his sermon, so the soldiers prepare their crossbows. The protagonist says it's time for class, but the soldiers don't listen and order to shoot the arrows. Suddenly, a lightning bolt destroys the crossbow, and the soldiers are scared by the electric spheres they see in the sky. The protagonist remembers Shelley's words, who told him that if they didn't listen, he had to find a way to keep them quiet. A method that doesn't harm them but makes them feel unable to resist, so they respect him as a teacher. And the protagonist tells them that if they make a mess, they will be punished. 6 days pass during the siege, and we see that the protagonist continues preaching. The soldiers complain about this, but they can't do anything because they will be struck by lightning if they interrupt him. And they wonder how much longer it will last, as they have been without food and water for days. Then the protagonist finishes for the day and tells them that he will give them food if they can answer his questions correctly. He asks the first question about verse 12 of chapter 3 of the sacred book. For a moment, no one responds until a soldier raises his hand. He asks if the protagonist will really give him food if he does, and the protagonist says that a paladin always keeps his word. So he answers the question, and the protagonist gives him a complete meal that surprises the other soldiers. They say they didn't think the ball of light could deliver food. So everyone raises their hands and starts saying that they will also answer. This surprises the protagonist, and he thinks that they are believing in what he says, just as Shelley said. Happily, he tells them not to rush and to answer one by one. There we see the girl explaining the method to make people listen to him. The first step is to scare them so much that they don't have a single thought of resistance. They start to wonder why they have to go through that and realize that it's because their lives are in the hands of the protagonist. Then he gives them the waiting for death and breaks their psychological defenses. And when those defenses are almost broken, he gives them relief. So they think that he could kill them at any moment but chose to save them and be kind to them. That will make them forget who trapped them and made them suffer from the beginning. Because only the one who gave them the benefit in the end matters, leaving only gratitude in their hearts, to the point where they could die for that person. We see a soldier thinking that they were actually the bad ones compared to the protagonist, who showed compassion. Shelley thinks that this is a despicable method, but if she explains cause and effect to the protagonist, he won't use it. The siege reaches day 15. And we learn that the king mysteriously disappeared. So on the same day, the soldiers in the castle announced their surrender, and the protagonist returned to the capital amid flowers and applause, even though it wasn't spring yet. The inhabitants went deep into the mountains to collect them themselves. We are told that people were afraid of the protagonist's knights, but they slowly realized that they were different because they delivered food to every house and solved every problem they had complained about. So they understood that the protagonist's victory marked a new era. We go back a few days before the protagonist's victory, where the soldiers pray fervently and receive food and provisions from the protagonist's light spheres. The king watches the whole scene while one of his men tells him that he should eat. He says they have no provisions, so he asks where the bread came from, and he understands that they followed the protagonist's rules to obtain it. They kneel in shame, but he asks them why they do it if everything is over. They insist that they can still fight and will always be his sword, so he shouldn't give up yet. But he tells them to forget it and asks them to look at the soldiers while asking how many of them will follow his orders, because they have forgotten that if the spirit had not sent the protagonist, they would be comfortably dining with their families. And since the church has not responded, it is their defeat, not the paladins, but the Holy Spirit who is not faithful to his word. Then he takes off his cape and says that the kingdom of Isaac is over, as it will now become a theocracy. So he releases them from their vows and tells them that the protagonist will not harm them because he is after their lives. So he will personally confront him. At that moment, a voice tells him that he is very brave and truly admires him. The soldiers try to protect the king, but a shadow passes beneath their feet and holds him, making him disappear into a pool of darkness. So the soldiers wonder if it is also the work of the protagonist. We see the king inside a strange dimension, who says he must do something because he can't breathe. But then Archbishop Andrew tells him that he can breathe and just needs to relax. There, he introduces himself and tells him that he is not his enemy, while making him consider how the protagonist can use powerful magic if he does not have the favor of the Holy Spirit, and if he ever considered the possibility that the protagonist is a magician. The monarch says that wouldn't be possible because human life is too short to accumulate decent magic. And Andrew tells him it would be possible if the protagonist were not human, as no one has seen his face beneath the armor, which is strange because that is not the attitude of a paladin. To his surprise, Andrew puts a hand on the king's shoulder and then proposes to reveal the true face of the protagonist under the sacred light. This makes the monarch smile with excitement. The day after the end of the siege on the castle, the citizens gather in front of the protagonist to express their gratitude for quickly resolving the crisis. It is mentioned that the merchant guild joined forces with the protagonist, news that spread rapidly throughout the continent. This expanded the influence of the merchant power beyond the kingdom of Isaac, reaching the entire continent of the Celts. We see other merchants who are surprised that Weber allied with the protagonist and wish to contact him by any means. Later on, we see all the resources and supplies that were sent to the protagonist by the merchants under Weber's influence. Iron says that will help the capital recover after the war. The excited protagonist wants to help move everything, but Iron tells him to leave it to her command, as she has more important things to take care of. We see that it involves sacks of paperwork, which are all the political affairs that accumulated during the month he fought against the king. Now he is the only one who can handle politics in the capital. The protagonist asks why it has to be him since he is a knight, not a politician, and she asks him back who else can take care of those matters apart from him. To which the protagonist and Bob respond by looking at her with tender eyes. But she puts on a fake smile and tells him that as the lady of the Becher Duchy, she cannot interfere in the affairs of the capital. And the protagonist accepts that there is no other way. She tells him not to worry because, even though it's his first time, Bob is very intelligent and can assist him. This motivates both of them, and they tell Iron that they won't fail. Both boys start working on the papers and see that there was a landslide in a city in the southwest. So the protagonist wants to allocate all the money to solve it, but Bob reminds him of another city that suffered from an insect plague. They make a list of all the needs to figure out how to deal with them. Some time later, the protagonist walks down the street while saying how interesting it is, as politics works like a magic matrix. Suddenly, something seems to attack him from behind, but when he stops it, he sees that it's a golden tiara. We see that Shelley threw it and says it's a gift to celebrate his victory. The protagonist says he loves it, and she asks if he has had a hard time dealing with government affairs. He tells her it has been fine because he enjoys the feeling of being busy, and he's almost done. So the girl asks him if he has time to go out with her, and he accepts. The protagonist asks Shelley why she wants to change her armor, and she explains that it's because hers is too flashy. She would be instantly recognized when she goes out, and as we see the armor she put on him, he asks if that's so bad. To which the girl responds that sometimes it's fun to see the world in a different light. She extends her hand for him to take as they leave, and it's mentioned that at that moment, the protagonist didn't realize the significance of Shelley's invitation. We see a bit of their date, where they stroll through alleyways, see exotic creatures and strange crafts. Some time later, the protagonist is happy with all the things to do in the capital. Suddenly, he sees the girl and asks if there's something bothering her. Compared to their last date, she doesn't seem as excited and hasn't said anything on the way. She tells him that he's very observant, so she asks him to accompany her to one last place. It turns out to be a forest with a gigantic tree, which surprises the protagonist as he didn't know the capital would have such a place. From there, they can also see the entire city, and Shelley says she found it the last time she was looking for a way out of this place. The protagonist asks the girl what she wants from him, and she reveals that she will soon be forced to return and get married. This leaves the protagonist thoughtful, and he comes up with the idea of congratulating her. But the cat hits him, as it's not something to congratulate since she looks sad. Shelley thanks him for the congratulations but says she doesn't want to go back. The protagonist says he read that a marriage should be a happy thing, but she explains that for her, it's like a chain that doesn't bring happiness. So she asks the protagonist for his help, and he says that if helping her escape is what she wants, it would be great because he's good at it. But she tells him that what she wants is a way to escape once and for all. She asks the protagonist to marry her, which confuses him and then scares him, and he asks why him. To which Shelley replies that there is no better option than him, as he is a single paladin with status and position, and he's not interested in what she does, which the protagonist admits is true. But he wonders if it would be okay for him to do it since he doesn't even know if she is a man or a woman. Shelley says she didn't expect him to be so distressed, so she asks if he already loves someone else besides Iron. The protagonist says he loves Iron, but Shelley insists if there is anyone else besides her. So he says he also loves her, and if he doesn't love anyone else, they should commit to each other. The protagonist asks why, if he really loves them all, but Shelley tells him it's not the same, and she asks him specifically what he loves about Iron. The protagonist says she is reliable, good-looking, and always supports him, and Shelley thinks it's the sentiment of a desperate child trying to praise his mother. So she asks if he wants to know the difference in the way Iron loves, and the protagonist says yes. So she tells him it's dependency, worship, and strong possessiveness. The protagonist says he doesn't feel any of that from Iron towards him, but the girl says he can't know, because her character is moderate. And on the day they had their conversation on the terrace, she sealed her love to maintain the same level of affection as him, because she is very proud and didn't want to lower herself due to her love. And the protagonist understands that on that day, Shelley was angry because he didn't respond positively to Iron's affection. But he doesn't fully understand her anger, and he concludes that Shelley loves Iron, so he asks if that's it. This leaves her speechless, and she quickly returns to the topic, reminding him that if he doesn't love anyone else but loves her, then they should commit to each other. And she asks if he accepts her proposal. The protagonist continues to hesitate and asks the cat what he should do. The cat tells him that it would be best to refuse, as he would be at risk of exposing his identity. But the protagonist says he wants to try revealing it. Shelley sees them whispering, so she tells him she only wants them to commit, not to get married, because a commitment can be broken at any time. And although she finds the protagonist interesting, she doesn't like him, so she won't meddle in who he is under the armor. And she tells him she doesn't care if he's human or not. This terrifies him and makes him wonder if he's been exposed and what he should do. She tells him that he's not very good at hiding things since he used extraordinary magic without the protection of an angel, something no human can do, but he didn't hide it, as if he expected to be discovered. And she says she's sure she wasn't the only one who noticed it, as Iron also suspected. And his enemies are not foolish, so they will try to remove his helmet in public. And even if they don't succeed, they will continue planning how to bring him down and accuse him of heresy, so he needs someone to have his back. That's why the commitment is a beneficial option that suits both of them. The protagonist asks when she suspected he wasn't human, and she tells him it was when he dared to protect Prince Bob because daring to disobey the church implied that his power didn't come from the Holy Spirit. And this, in turn, meant that he must belong to a superior race skilled in magic. Vivian finds this surprising and says that Shelley is interesting for reaching that conclusion. The protagonist asks if she knows which race he belongs to, and she says she has an idea. She says he can't be a demon because he has a guardian angel, and the fact that he wears a helmet means his appearance is very different from humans, so the possibilities are greatly reduced. Then the protagonist says that she wanted to commit to him knowing his identity, and suddenly he starts removing his armor. Catherine tries to stop him, but Vivian blocks her. So the protagonist continues, telling Shelley that if she feels scared, she can leave. And he tells her she guessed right, so he doesn't want to keep hiding it. And he shows her that his true self is a Lich born from death. This leaves the girl speechless. The protagonist thinks she must be terrified and wonders if he can still be a paladin. But all she says is that he is very small because she thought he was an adult due to the size of the armor. And the protagonist explains that he usually uses puppets to control it, which fascinates her as she learns about the existence of a new type of magic. The protagonist feels relieved and asks if she's not afraid of him since many humans pursued him for being undead. She admits that it would be intimidating if he were taller, but not so much, and he has never done anything to scare her. So she asks if they can now consider committing to each other, and he accepts. Both of them return to the city, and the protagonist looks very happy. He gave Shelley magic so she could understand the cat, so the cat explains to her that it's because someone finally recognized him as an undead, and she says she didn't expect it to be him who guided her all that time. Although the cat says that the true masterminds are Vivian and Catherine behind her. Suddenly, a girl bumps into the noble, and in a hurry, she tries to leave when the protagonist catches her and tells her to return what she stole from Shelley. The girl asks to be released when Shelley realizes she doesn't have her wallet. The girl says she doesn't know anything, but the protagonist warns her that according to the law, if it's discovered that she has the stolen object, her hand will be taken away, and she will be thrown into a cell. So the girl returns it and apologizes, asking not to be accused before the magistrate. The protagonist scolds her for stealing at such a young age, but the girl says it's because her mother is very sick. The protagonist tells her that in that case, she should go to the knights for help, but she says she has already been there. But her father stole the money for medicine to buy alcohol, so she couldn't go back to the knights for money. And Shelley understands her situation, so she gives her a gold coin to buy the medicine and tells her not to let her father steal from her again. The girl leaves, and Shelley sees that the protagonist is pensive. He tells her he's thinking that the legal code doesn't account for those kinds of situations. And Shelley tells him that he just has to add it, as he is now in charge of the army and the laws in the capital, so he can make those changes, which excites the protagonist. Later, we see Bob drowsy while working on documents when the protagonist arrives and says he needs to talk to him. This scares the boy because he doesn't recognize him, but the protagonist tells him who he is and that he has a great idea to share with him. Some time later, the bells start ringing in the city, and the inhabitants understand that the protagonist is going to announce a new decree. So they wonder if he's really going to be their new king, and if that happens, they say they wouldn't lose anything, because the protagonist is better than the nobles of the past. There we see him explaining to them that due to the absence of government caused by the king's disappearance, and after talking with Bob, he decided to present a series of new laws. The first one being that every citizen will receive 10 gold coins weekly, which no one can take by force, and those who do will be punished. In addition, the government will provide subsidies in case of family problems, illness, or unemployment. And this decree is effective immediately, so they ask everyone to form a line to register one by one. And they realize that what he says is true, so everyone starts praising the Paladin and Prince Bob. In a tavern, the inhabitants discuss the protagonist's reforms, but they say he reduced the severity of the penal code. As a result, the death penalty was abolished, and punishments for most crimes were reduced to only 2 or 3 days in jail. This excites the citizens, who begin to wonder if it will be the same for all kinds of crimes. One of them mentions that maybe the protagonist did it because he thought the previous laws were too harsh, and they wonder how the few knights of the protagonist could control a city of 100,000 inhabitants. So many crimes won't be discovered. But then we see them arresting a grandmother for killing her husband 60 years ago. They also arrest a man accused of spying on his neighbor's daughter, and another man who beat his wife and children the day before after coming home. The arrests continue, and they apprehend a mage for scamming people on the street, a child for throwing garbage, even though he was just picking it up, and even a dog for defecating on the ground. This overwhelms the citizens, who feel like there are a pair of eyes watching them all the time, as they cannot escape the surveillance of the knights. And while they wonder how they do it, we see a bunch of spiritual fires floating around the city. Then we see a boy courting a girl in the forest, who tells him he is very bold. So one of the ghosts reports that he found someone harassing a young girl, and within seconds, the knights appear and arrest him on suspicion of harassing women. And then they arrest Shelly, who, thanks to the protagonist's magic, can see all the ghosts, and she says it's a big problem, because she only told the protagonist to make some laws to protect women and children, so she decides to go talk to him. But when she arrives, she sees Iron scolding the protagonist and telling him to stop wasting money, or he'll ruin the whole country. He argues that there's nothing wrong with a society where everyone is rich like the nobility, and nobody makes mistakes. But she tells him that the citizens don't generate that wealth, but he imposes it on them, creating an ideal country that only belongs to him, not the people. So he ignores what the people need, but he insists that he doesn't, because he gave them riches and money to cultivate, while making liberal laws from their point of view. And he asks if that's not what they need, to which Iron angrily replies no and asks why he's so stubborn. The protagonist says it's because he didn't do anything wrong, and even if she scolds him, he won't change. Until finally, Shelly throws a bucket of water at them and tells them to calm down. The protagonist tries to ask for her help in that matter, but Iron gives up and tells him to do whatever he wants because she's not responsible for the people of the capital. We see Iron despairing, and we are told that the protagonist hadn't seen such emotions from her since they argued about trying to take the children into battle. But just like on that occasion, the protagonist wasn't mistaken. This time he was also convinced that he hadn't made any mistakes. He believed that distributing gold for subsistence, teaching lessons to wrongdoers by arresting them, and encouraging people were good actions. And we see Turtle observing the people cheering for the protagonist from the window, and he says that he is very famous these days. So if he writes that novel, he will be able to achieve a great sale. 3 months later, we see the girl who stole from Shelly and her mother being beaten by her father because she reported him to the protagonist's knights. And the protagonist challenges her to report him again because he will only spend a few days in jail, and then come back to beat her to death. There, Carl reports to the protagonist that the number of such incidents has increased. And the protagonist says he already knows and wonders why the girl's mother didn't take her away from such a man since their laws allow for divorce. But Carl tells him that doing so would cause them difficulties in living. The protagonist asks what would happen if he forces them, and Carl tells him that they would then hold a grudge against him, because the protagonist believes that he will save them with divorce, but the reality is that people discriminate against those who get divorced, which would make them suffer more, and he couldn't arrest people for discrimination because it's not a crime. Then the protagonist asks why the father beats them, and Carl explains that it's because he is unemployed. When he had a job, he didn't have time to beat his family because when he came home, he would fall asleep. But thanks to the protagonist, he no longer felt the need to work and quit his job. This is happening to many people due to the support the protagonist decreed for those who were unemployed. This caused them to change and act like they were rich, which in turn made people from other countries come and sell their products at inflated prices. But people didn't care about this, so the country's wealth is rapidly diminishing. And people have become lazy because they enjoy their wealth, but don't work for it. At this rate, Isaac will become the poorest country in the world. We see the protagonist riding outside the city until he arrives at a small dilapidated house. He says he can't believe there's no one there and wonders why they don't want to cultivate the land when he gave them the most fertile ones in the entire kingdom. The cat explains that it's because the cultivators make more money than the landowners, so they prefer to enjoy life rather than work on farming the land. But the protagonist says that money can't make them happy forever, and the cat says that there's nothing better for humans than getting something for nothing. The protagonist agrees and wonders what he has been doing all this time. Then Carl appears accompanied by Shelly, who says she found them and knew they must be around there. She asks Carl to leave them alone, and the cat says it's fine and withdraws. The protagonist asks if she's there to scold him, but she asks why she would do that. And the protagonist says because he is leading the nation towards disaster. She asks him to tell her in detail, and the protagonist tells her that he is turning workers into lazy people, that if they don't cultivate, even if they have money, people will die of hunger. She says that food can be bought from other countries, but the protagonist responds that they are already doing that. But there is no unlimited food, and they are running out of money. She agrees that it's true and that he should also reflect on his terrible legislation. And he agrees, as he wants to stop crimes, but new offenses keep happening. Besides, he wanted to eradicate evil, but good people turn bad because no matter how much he modifies the laws, they always find legal loopholes. So he says he will destroy that country. Shelley confirms this and says there will be famines, plagues, and dozens of people will die because of him. Then Catherine tells him that's why she didn't support his overthrow of the king, because order and justice have no value for humans. If someone is just or generous, they will take advantage of it. So what humanity needs is not justice but proper guidance, which is what the angels have been doing. Vivian says she doesn't care what humanity does and believes the protagonist is doing a great job. But the good side of it all is that these months have given her a new perception of humanity and the world. Catherine tells the protagonist that he has a good understanding of what is right but is just doing things the wrong way. And she says that humans can only toughen up through suffering. This leads to an argument between Catherine and Vivian, and in the midst of it, Shelley asks if they know why humanity needs laws. She says that the protagonist has been revising the laws to promote benevolence, but without considering why humans need laws. The protagonist says they are for maintaining social order, and she agrees but points out that the methods he used for that purpose have turned out to be a failure. So the protagonist asks what he should do, and Shelley tells him that he should judge the vicious when at that moment he is doing the opposite. Since there is no price to pay for doing evil, no one wants to be a good person. Therefore, what victims need is not an apology from criminals but a price to be paid by the aggressor. It could be property, freedom, or life, and everyone should know the consequences of breaking the rules, so that people won't dare to break them. And when the protagonist wants to complain, she emphasizes that it's not tyranny. In the past, people were afraid of strict laws because of the possibility of a wrongful trial. But with the sky filled with eyes and ears, that is impossible. So the protagonist eagerly asks what he should do with all the problems. And she suggests getting food from neighboring countries and borrowing grains because they still have time to harvest. And he should put an end to the policy of making money and replace it with one that rewards hard work in farming. And those who don't work should starve to death, which scares the protagonist. But she reminds him of what she said about only rewarding the good. Then Catherine warns the protagonist that such a policy change can easily provoke people's anger in a short time. So she asks Shelley what to do in that case, and Shelley tells her to punish and kill them. The protagonist opposes it, but she tells him that without blood, there is no law. And that's the only thing that works with the human race, because everything ended up like this due to his idealistic attitude of governing, which cannot deter the villains. And the price to get the capital back on track is blood, because it will flow anyway, either through the restoration of norms or through famine and riots. The protagonist says he understands, so he promises to change, and they start discussing how the laws should be modified. Meanwhile, we see Andrew and the king observing them and wondering who the girl is. And they say that soon, with the riots, the time to act will come, especially with the help of Archbishop Dean. We go back 3 months to the celebration of the victory in the castle, where Archbishop Dean congratulates the protagonist on his triumph. The cat and Vivian realize that his rise was a move by the church. The protagonist climbs the stairs and greets the prince and Dean, when the latter tells him that he has something to discuss with him about the royal family and the future of the kingdom. So the protagonist asks if he is speaking on behalf of the church, but the clergyman says no, it's personal, so the protagonist agrees. Both enter, and Dean asks him to call him as he used to, as he is there as a friend. But the cat says he can't say that with the archbishop's hat on and tells the protagonist not to believe him. The protagonist responds to the bishop that he knows he came to see him because the church has a strong opinion of him. And the bishop affirms that the church believes he is doing everything wrong. But he believes that there is no difference between the protagonist and them because they seek the same results. But the protagonist's methods are different. And the protagonist asks what they think about the matter of Bob. Dean confirms to him that the death of the boy and the other princes was approved by the church, who only recognize the last survivor as they have done for hundreds of years. And the protagonist tells him that it's not right because it's a sin to have the blood of a king on one's hands. something the church knows, and those who sin must receive judgment, even if they are the king of a nation. Dean then asks to speak informally and says that the protagonist is the noblest knight he has ever known. And then he tells him that the church designated him as the Archbishop of the kingdom because they know him and wanted to use him as an intermediary, because they want to know what he wants. The protagonist then tells him that he wants them to declare the king guilty and remove him from the throne to restore justice. So Dean asks if he is upset, and the protagonist says he was just thinking about how he could politely reject his proposal, because he still feels goodwill towards him, and good intentions should not be disappointed. Dean is glad to be recognized, and he says he knew he would reject his offer from the beginning. So he asks him to say what he has to say without fear. So the protagonist decides to be honest and says that to restore the king's honor, it is necessary to say that he did not commit any crime. But accepting this would only encourage such a crime. And Dean thinks he understands those things, but no one has dared to question them in hundreds of years. The conversation ends, and the archbishop is exhausted, wondering what he will tell the pope, when Andrew appears behind him and asks if he needs his help, so he asks him for a dossier on the protagonist and everyone around him. Back to the present, people gather because the protagonist will issue another decree. They wonder what it will be this time, if they will be given spouses or if they will be granted noble titles. Suddenly, they find him tied to a crucifix, and they wonder why he is there. Irene and Abby are among the crowd, equally surprised. Then Shelley appears, introducing herself as Sarai, and says she is the one judging the paladin who condones people's pleasures. Abby recognizes her, and Irene realizes that Sarai is the name of the mother of Isaac's first king. Next, we see the protagonist reviewing the plan to restore the capital's laws with Shelley. He says he will gather his knights to do it immediately, but she tells him it's midnight, and everyone should be asleep. The protagonist says they should then wake them up, but Shelley replies that it will only make it harder to fulfill the decree, and she already has a way to make the people accept it, but it will depend on whether they are willing to suffer. So the protagonist asks what it is about, and Shelley reminds him of his own words when he said that a man should be judged according to his crimes, even if he is a king. We return to the present, and Shelley says that in just 90 days of the protagonist's rules, 100,000 people became addicted to pleasure and degradation. Therefore, the protagonist is sentenced to have the holy fire incinerate all his sins, and the cross is set on fire along with him. Meanwhile, we see that it is the protagonist who created the fire. People panic and try to save the paladin while calling Shelley a witch, but suddenly the protagonist's knights block them. People violently demand why they are protecting the witch, and the knights start beating the rioters. Shelley explains that people dare to shout at a paladin because they know he won't harm them, but they won't do it if they know that the person they're shouting at could kill them. Then Carl announces that the protagonist has been stripped of his ruling power, rendering all decrees null and void. And according to the original law, those who assault the execution ground must be beheaded. So they prepare the inhabitants for punishment when the protagonist tells them to stop and that he will assume the blame for all their sins. Shelley reveals that the plan was for her to take away people's happiness, so that the protagonist would be seen as the one being punished on behalf of the people. And the only way to atone for his sins is through work. In a separate room, Benedict says that the protagonist is a fool for letting himself be tied to the crucifix, and that it's his opportunity to incite rebellion. But Andrew says that it's actually a smart move because all the bad deeds were attributed to Shelley without affecting the protagonist's reputation among the people. Benedict asks what to do, and Andrew replies to leave it to him. During the night, we see a group of people scaling the walls of the church and sneaking inside. They see the protagonist still engulfed in flames and wonder if his knights are really trying to burn him. One of them asks what they should do now, and the boy who seems to be the leader says they must find a way to cut the rope that binds him. Suddenly, the protagonist asks if anyone is there, and the boy says he is the first soldier who responded to his question during the siege of the castle. The protagonist says he remembers him, he just doesn't know his name. The boy says they are there to rescue him, and they will lower him down soon. But the protagonist tells them not to, as that is the punishment he deserves. The boy tells him that everyone thinks Shelley is wrong for blaming those who are lazy. But the protagonist says it was he who made them that way with his wrong policies, which caused a crisis that made the land infertile and led good people to sin. The boy says they still respect him as a ruler, but the protagonist responds that if they truly respect him, then they should support the reforms that will be introduced in the future. So they kneel and obey his orders. We are told that the next day all of the protagonist's laws were abolished. The new reforms were supported by Irene and some nobles, which angered the lower classes, but they did nothing out of fear of the knights. We see the dissatisfied people considering desertion rather than returning to work. Then we see Shelley frustrated because this keeps happening, which delays the work in the lands. In addition, the protagonist dismissed the entire militia to save money, so she asks Carl to find her a secretary because she will need the help. She says she is exhausted when a shadow appears behind her and she senses its presence, so she attacks, asking who is there. But there doesn't seem to be anyone, so she relaxes because the room is protected by the protagonist's magic, preventing ordinary people from entering. And we see that the shadow was Andrew, who says that the fun is about to begin because he put something in the girl's drink. The newly appointed ministers inform Shelley that the aqueducts are damaged, but the engineers are demanding too much to fix them. There are also more people who prefer to go to jail instead of working, so they are protesting in the streets to free the protagonist. Shelley sees that there is indeed a mob demanding the release of the protagonist, and upon seeing the girl, they prepare to attack. So she asks them if they really want her to set him free, or if all they want is to be paid. They know she's right, but they don't acknowledge it and say that she has no right to judge a paladin and knows nothing about them. So she says she can pay them as well and orders Paz to give it to them. The mercenary tells her she's very generous, but he doesn't care, so he takes a box full of treasures and throws it towards the protesters, telling them to enjoy it. This drives them crazy with greed, and they throw themselves to the ground to collect all the money. Paz says that no one wants to save the paladin now, so even he starts to feel sorry for him. And he asks Shelley if he really deserves to be voluntarily tied to the crucifix for them. To which the girl responds that it's okay because the situation will improve, and everyone has the right to call people fools because they were never taught dignity, how to read or write, and no one treated them as human beings, until the protagonist arrived, who gave them the right to be equal, but they didn't know how to use it and tried to defend their interests in the only way they knew. So it's not their fault to be like this, but the fault of the cruel rulers of the past, and she will slowly teach them to change for the better. Shelley and her group plan to leave after the commotion ends when Andrew says she shouldn't expect to leave so soon, and he starts reciting a spell that suddenly throws Shelley off her horse in pain. In a matter of seconds, she transforms into a demon. The priests of the church then appear and convince the people that what they should do is kill the demon and save the protagonist. So Shelley's soldiers prepare to hold back the mob so that Paz can get the girl out of there, while he thinks it's the fault of the papacy. The protagonist's arm is broken in half, but he is able to regenerate it immediately. He says he's fortunate to be able to do so with the soul fire, otherwise he would be ashes. There, he remembers that the man in the painting at the church was also burned at the stake, and he feels sad that, not being a Lich, he couldn't take advantage of that time for reflection. So he thinks he should spend more time understanding humans rather than imitating what he read in his novel. And he wonders how much longer he has to hang there when suddenly he feels the magic that affected Shelley. One of his knights informs him that Shelley has turned into a demon and her vital signs are slowly weakening. In addition, the haunted residents of the capital are chasing them, and he cannot face them. Vivian says that the church has finally intervened, and Catherine admits that, although they represent the Holy Spirit, they are a human organization. And when they cannot obtain permission from the spirit, they rely on some other power. And we see that Andrew decapitated the protagonist's soldiers while wondering how there can be a necromancer summoning ghosts in a city governed by a paladin. And he says it's because they are the same person, so he asks Paz to hand over the girl. But Paz says he won't do it because mercenaries are all about trust and loyalty. Andrew mocks him, and while killing him, he says that trust is the last thing humans should talk about. At that moment, the protagonist frees himself from the cross because the communication with his knight was cut off, which means Shelley is in danger and he must go immediately. But then all the people arrive to say they've come to save him. They tell him they've defeated the demon, so now he can restore the decree and pay them. But this worries the protagonist, who asks what they did to Shelley. But they say what they did is fine because that's what the protagonist taught them according to the sacred book. But he tells them that's not what it says, and then they reveal that none of them can read or write, so they didn't read it. Setting that aside, they insist that he pay them, when suddenly Andrew arrives with Shelley. There we see Abby informing Irene of the situation, and she understands that it's the church's fault, so it can't be good. And she says they must hurry to the protagonist because the Pope is trying to make the protagonist lose his head in front of everyone. While we see the protagonist trying to strike Andrew, the agent offers a deal to the protagonist, who asks who he is and what he did to Shelley. Catherine says he is an elf who abandoned the sacred faith. Andrew calls the protagonist a necromancer and introduces himself as the Archmage of the Alliance of Human Mages, there to negotiate on behalf of the church. Vivian mocks him because she believes the protagonist is a necromancer. Andrew offers reconciliation with the church, allowing King Benedict to return and removing his people from the capital. and if he does so, Andrew will return Shelley to her original form and keep his secret. But the protagonist refuses, so Andrew draws his sword and asks the protagonist to kill the demon with his own hands. He tells him that he used magic to ensure she doesn't die, even if he pierces her heart, but he must keep in mind that his magic won't work on her. This angers the protagonist, who leaps forward and strikes Andrew away. He then kneels beside Shelley and asks if she's okay, but she tells him not to help her, and the protagonist responds that he will treat her immediately. Andrew says the blow hurt him because it wasn't the fist of a necromancer at all, but wonders if hitting him like that was a good idea. We see the confused people, who begin to suspect that the protagonist may be corrupted by the demon, and they come to the conclusion that they must kill Shelley. The protagonist tells them she is not a demon, but she tells him to torture her and prepare to execute her, and she asks him to let her die. Andrew is surprised by this and calls Shelley wise, so he asks the protagonist if they should send her to the post where he was. There, the protagonist begins to remember everything that happened to become a paladin, and the advice from each of his friends. So he tells the people that she is not a demon, and they will no longer receive money, as it was their sin that made them what they are. And he tells them that he will be with them in the process, but then someone throws an egg at him, and they tell him they don't need that, because all they want is for him to pay them. Andrew tells him that the evil of humanity is greater than that of a demon, but the protagonist insists that the innocent should not be punished and tells the people that if they insist on executing her, they will have to go through his dead body first. The protagonist tells them that as a paladin, he won't strike anyone, but they will have to strike him to reach Shelley. Then the king says that the protagonist fell in the company of a dark being, but the Holy Spirit did not abandon them, as he brought him back. This surprises the people, and the protagonist sees that Dean is with him, so he asks if he planned that deception with them. He wants to deny it, but the king silences him and says that the protagonist wants to take a demon as his wife. The people ask if it's true, and the protagonist confirms that she is indeed his fiancée. So Benedict mocks him and declares that the demon and the protagonist should be executed, and he says that on the day of his coronation, he will enact a new law to continue giving them money. This convinces the people, and they prepare to execute him and Shelley. But suddenly, a sacred spell sends the furious mob flying, and we see that it is Catherine, which surprises the protagonist. She asks Dean if the church isn't even bothering to hide it anymore, and he is speechless, as is the people at her appearance. The protagonist tells her that he hopes she knows how much he appreciates her help, and then we see a memory of her in front of a dying boy, who tells her that he doesn't need her salvation because angels are never willing to help someone while they are alive, only to regret it once they die, making them hypocrites. And as she prepares another attack, Catherine tells him that she is aware that she cannot help him due to the agreement with the Holy Spirit, but she doesn't want to see a fire easily extinguished again, nor just grit her teeth and let the wind carry away the ashes. And she shoots a sacred arrow that sends more people flying. Then we see Tenidos arrive quickly, and Catherine says that she summoned him, and with a swift movement, she mounts him and tells him to get out of there, and find the solution he believes is right for that situation because he must achieve it for the kingdom to return to its original state. And we see Holy Rays immobilize Catherine. They tell her that she broke the oath between the protagonist and the Holy Spirit, so they will return her to heaven to be judged. This moves the protagonist, who tells all his knights to drop what they're doing and evacuate the people from the Becher Duchy to leave the capital. But it's only a temporary retreat because they will return. And that's how the 5th part of this manhwa ends. If you've reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you've been one of the few people to get here, so comment the word Paladin in the comments. Remember to subscribe to not miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.